can you tell us a bit about your relationship with Roy Thomas?
Yes, that was one of the most fortuitous relationships I had in my career. Roy came along just after I'd finished working on the Tarzan comic books with Russ Manning. Within a short period after that, I had been at Comic-Con and I'd met Roy Thomas. And then again, I was introduced to him personally by Harlan Ellison, who was a friend of a man named Richard Kyle, who was a kind of a book dealer in Long Beach, California, but also a talent scout who just loved finding new talent. And he knew Roy was going to be speaking at UCLA while I was living in Orange County, California, which was near Los Angeles. And he set it up so that Harlan Ellison, who was going to be at the same speaking event, would introduce me to Roy. Within a few months, Roy called me to ask me if I wanted to become part of his cadre of talent that he wanted to develop in LA, because he was staying at Marvel Comics, but leaving the New York offices to move to Los Angeles to pursue some film opportunities. So he wanted a group of people around him that he could deal with right there on in person. And I was the first guy he chose. It was really lucky. And I ended up started off doing some simple illos and stuff, illustrations for Savage Sword of Conan and things like that. But then the opportunity popped up to draw some covers for the Star Wars comic books. And this was the very first Star Wars comics that Howard Chaykin was drawing the interiors, and Steve Leialoha was inking that stuff. And Roy had talked Marvel into doing Star Wars. They really didn't want to do it. They wanted to do it as a one-shot comic, and Roy absolutely refused to do it. And he insisted if they didn't do the comic, he was going to basically leave the company, which, was common in those days to make high threats that you really never intended to carry out. But they didn't want to lose Roy Thomas. He was quite popular. So Roy called me after the first issue was solicited. And then how they did it in those days is they would solicit a cover months ahead of the comic book being published, and the cover was done ahead of the interiors of the comics. So by the time that solicitation necessities for cover number 2 came along, Howard Chaykin was overwhelmed with work on the interiors, and Roy said, "Would you like to do some of the covers for this?" And I jumped at the opportunity, having read in the LA Times for a number of months, even years, about George Lucas working on this film, because I was a fan of Lucas's American Graffiti and THX 1138, and I realized what Star Wars might be, because it was a large budget science fiction film. I had no idea how good it would be, of course, but yes, I wanted to jump right on that, and I got the opportunity to do those, and they made my career. I did 4 of the first 6 covers, and then the Treasury Edition covers, which are so well known. And it basically made my career and solidified a relationship with Lucasfilm after that. I continued until just recently doing style guide artwork for their characters for the Star Wars films.
And you were already a big fan of science fiction, Buck Rogers and stuff
exactly.
Like that.
Flash Gordon, right behind your shoulder there, I see Flash Gordon. I was a huge Flash Gordon fan, and I knew that George Lucas's influence was Flash Gordon. In fact, I knew, having read Charles Champlin's writings in the LA Times, that he had tried to get the rights to Flash Gordon and he couldn't get them, so he decided to create something on his own. And he started working with some very well-known storytellers, and they basically crafted this great epic adventure, at least the first 3 movies. And it was just something I was just enthralled with when I saw the first film. I couldn't believe how good it was. And I thought, I've stepped into something really good here.
Cool. It is without shadow of doubt one of the franchises with the biggest worldwide following. As a creative agent yourself, what seems to you to be the secret of this longevity and this cult following that Star Wars gathered?
Well, for one thing, I think it came at a time when there wasn't anything like it. Those kinds of swashbuckling adventure films were a thing of the past at that moment. And I grew up, my favorite movie of all time is The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. So I grew up watching swashbucklers. I love them. I love pirate films. I love pretty much any swashbuckling film with Errol Flynn or Tyrone Power in it. And I just really became enamored of them. And when this came along, and I realized, having seen the film, that it wasn't a science fiction film per se. It was a fantasy swashbuckler, basically. But it was based in epic mythology. It had that great storytelling building of the hero who goes on a journey and finds a treasure that changes his life and reforms him into a great person. And that was Luke Skywalker. But it also had these wonderful characters around him, that, because a hero is really kind of a boring character, but if you surround him with interesting characters and friends and villains, you've really got something. And Lucas knew that. I mean, Darth Vader and Han Solo and Leia and the two droids, those are just wonderful characters, which of course he took from various other areas, such as Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, and even The Searchers, the John Wayne Western. These characters were all kind of reformed from that, but that's the nature of storytelling, is that you take what you knew and you make it your own and then make something new out of it. So I think at the time, everybody just needed some escapism and they needed some heroes. And that opened the door to the whole mythology, American mythology, which has since become so important to even the world. I mean, we've also gotten these interests going in other countries, which was there to begin with, but because of the epic movie making and so forth, it enabled filmmakers in Europe and Japan and other areas to go to producers and say, hey, we can do this. And they've created some wonderful films too. So it just created a whole new era of epic filmmaking and special effects and so forth, to where now we have the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and we have all of these great things like The Mandalorian on Disney Plus and so forth and so on. Just all sorts of really fun things. And there's more than just the Disney stuff. There's tons of other stuff there.
What are your personal thoughts regarding the place where the franchise is right now?
I like it, especially on television. I think that The Mandalorian is probably the best thing that's happened to Star Wars since The Empire Strikes Back. It's quite amazing what they've done with that. I think they made some missteps along the way, but gee, trying to recapture lightning in a bottle like they got with those first three movies, I understand that it's not the same as the originals, but that's hard to do, and fans are horrifically critical of these things when they really don't have any reason to be. They just aren't getting the same effect they got, so they're acting like children about the whole thing, in my estimation. But I've liked a lot of it. I've enjoyed a lot of it. I think Rey is one of the best characters in Star Wars. I think there's a lot of very cool things in these latest three. The prequels weren't great films, but they certainly had some fun moments in them. And the final film, The Revenge of the Sith, was really a fun film. I thought it was quite good. But the problem with those prequels is the fact that everybody knew what was going to happen. I mean, Lucas had told us what was going to happen, so you knew exactly how it was going to end, you know? So that was a problem that they had going in. But boy, that introduction of and creation of Darth Vader at the end of that was really dramatic and horrifying, I thought.
As a comic book artist, you have worked for the two giants, Marvel and DC. If you had to single out two works, one for each of these companies that you've made, what were the works that you enjoyed the most?
I think All-Star Squadron was the best experience I had in comics because I got to deal with all these heroes during World War II, which is a period that I just love. I just think it's the great period of superheroes because it's that period when they were created. That is, that you had this this wonderful moment where the Jews in America who were doing a lot of work in comics needed a way to express themselves about what was going on overseas. Have you ever read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, that wonderful book by Michael Chabon? It's about two Jewish boys who get into the comic book business, one who's actually escaped the Holocaust, and his cousin, a boy who'd grown up in, I think it was Brooklyn or the Bronx, and how they create these wonderful works that manifest the birth of great American comics. But he also includes, he doesn't just use made up characters like these gentlemen. He uses Jack Kirby and Gil Kane and Stan Lee. They all make appearances in this. He keeps it grounded in the reality of what was happening. But just this whole idea that they had created a way to fight back, if only in spirit, and that the first time we ever saw the Nazis attacked or abused as enemies was on the cover of Captain America #1 by Jakob Kurtzberg, known as Jack Kirby. And that says a lot to me. And I think that getting a chance to draw those kinds of characters, because the Justice Society fits right in there. They're the original superhero team. And it was just a real enjoyable moment to work with Roy Thomas on those characters, and his scripts were always so literate and so well thought out and grounded in the history of what was going on, that it was a pure pleasure to work with them. It always was a pure pleasure to work with them. At Marvel, I had a very short experience there because I was working with Roy, but my tenure was shortened by the fact that I went into animation and I needed to get into that. When I had the opportunity, I did. So I walked away from working with Roy, and he brought me over to DC years later, him and Dick Giordano. And I lasted at DC for many years. I think I worked at DC for something like 15 years on and off. I continued to work in animation there also, just because I loved animation, and I also enjoyed the fact that I had union benefits and a pension I could work on. So that's helped me get to where I am today as a retired artist. I can still work, but I still have an income coming in. So the whole idea of the working with Roy was just great, though. I loved working with him all the time. And at Marvel, I'd have to say it was probably either the Star Wars books or those few What If books that I did, because I worked on some of the original What Ifs. In fact, one of them was the one where Don Bluth and I created the Thordis character, which has become this mighty Thor, female Thor character, which they're going to use in the movies. And I always loved doing those kind of things. Those were really fun. I'd have loved to have done more at Marvel, but once I got in at DC Comics, I felt that was where my bed was feathered, and I loved those characters as much as I loved the Marvel Comics characters. So it wasn't a hard choice for me.
I understand you were introduced to comics by your father, and that you first fell in love with Tarzan. Curiously enough, as far as I know, the first character you came to draw professionally was Tarzan. Can you tell us a bit about this first spark that, in a way, took over your life and transformed the path you take
Yeah. It actually started with my dad, who used to draw. You know what Kilroy is? It was a little figure that the American GIs used to leave to taunt the Nazis when they were in World War II. And it just basically said, the Americans have been here, and they'd always write Kilroy was here. My dad was drawing this, and this interested me. But he also introduced me to Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movies, which were playing a lot at the time in the afternoons and the evenings when I was a young kid. And he bought me a Tarzan comic book. And from there, I was kind of hooked on comics. I liked Tarzan a lot. I read a number of Tarzan comics, but I expanded it quickly to things like Batman and Superman and Sad Sack and Archie and those kinds of comics.
Going back to your childhood, Jonni Quest, it seems like lightning does strike twice at the same spot with regards to your career. The same way that you started working in Tarzan, that was something you enjoyed a lot as a boy. I do understand that Jonni Quest was one of your favorite shows. And you came to work with Doug Wildey in Godzilla. So how was this experience?
No, it was wonderful. Doug Wildey is just a wonderful gentleman and a character that you couldn't believe. And yes, Jonni Quest was highly influential to me as a child. I loved adventure comics, but I'd never seen anything like Jonni Quest. Well, I'd seen the 1940s Max Fleischer Superman cartoons, which were shown infrequently on local cartoon shows. But the Jonni Quest show was so comic book brought to life. In fact, years later, getting to know Doug, we would discuss the fact that he particularly went for artists like Warren Tufts and Alex Toth and Tony Segroy, who drew really well and solid and had a history in comics, because he knew the show couldn't do a lot of animation because it would look terrible. So they did everything as kind of pictures with radio with pictures, is what Jay Ward used to call it, where they would literally show things, slide images, do a tiny bit of animation, and of course, mouth animation. But it was a comic strip brought to life, and it was kind of a cross between a science fiction story and Terry and the Pirates, which was exactly what Doug would have described it as, that he wanted to do Terry and the Pirates, but he also brought in what he said was science. There was a science magazine, Scientific American. He said the two influences were Terry and the Pirates and Scientific American. Well, that's where he got the idea for the first episode's laser beam, which was pretty much, I think, the first time a laser beam was used on a television show. I'm pretty sure it was then became a rote thing after that, very common. But it may have been used in a movie in Goldfinger before that. But I think Jonni Quest predates Goldfinger. I'm just guessing at this. Nonetheless, Doug was just a fun guy to work with. He was very individual, and he had called me upon taking over Godzilla because at the time, Hanna-Barbera was basically a shop that did funny animal cartoons and things like that. And the nearest thing they even got to shows where they had characters who were more realistic was Scooby-Doo and Super Friends. And those were still geared toward really young children because we had this standards and practices problem that came up in the late 60s in American television, where the censorship was really ham-fisted about no guns, no violence, no this, no that. They thought that television was, a reason for American violence, like that's the reason Americans are violent, But nonetheless, we had to abide by these things. So Jonni Quest kind of action was out of the question. But Godzilla, we got to do a lot of fun things with because it was a kaiju-oriented show with a lot of monsters and stuff. And you could sink ships and things like that as long as you saw the sailors escaping and so forth and so on. But working with Doug especially was a blast because he had gotten hold of me, and he got hold of Will Mineo by calling Mark Evanier, the writer, who knew all of us. And Mark was also a guy who loved to get talent started in the business. And he gave Doug my phone number, and he gave Doug Will's phone number. And we actually ended up getting interviewed and starting on the same day and becoming great friends who worked together for years after that. And we both loved Doug's work. We became his acolytes. In fact, at Hanna-Barbera, we were kind of like a small group, which included also Dave Stevens, who were known for hanging out with Doug and being kind of his bad boys. And it was a fun group to be in. But a lot of people at Hanna-Barbera did not like Doug because he was a wise ass, and he was always giving hell to other producers and stuff. I remember one time when Alex Lovey, who was, a producer and a head guy at Hanna-Barbera for many years, was walking down a hall in a really loud plaid jacket. And Doug just couldn't hold himself back while we're all with him. He says to Alex, as Alex is walking away, he says, "Hey, Alex, that's a great jacket. That ought to be back in style any day now." And that was basically Doug Wildey. He was kind of a cross between Clint Eastwood and Bugs Bunny. And that's what it was so much fun to hang out with. Of course, his jobs didn't last very long because of that. Because once Godzilla was done, he was off to the next gig somewhere. But it got me started in the business. And I ended up working on Godzilla and Jana of the Jungle with him. And at Hanna-Barbera, Super Friends also, and a little bit of Scooby-Doo, although I just never liked Scooby-Doo, so I didn't last long on it. I just don't understand the interest in it.
Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, The Hulk. It seems like a playground to any comic book lover. Can you tell us a bit about those experiences working with such iconic characters?
Yeah, that was a blast for me. Again, Will Mineo was over there, and Larry Houston came in, another friend of mine, and we were all avid fans of comic books, specifically Marvel comics. And with Stan there, it was just a wonderful moment for us. And we were the ones who really, because they had already started doing Spider-Man, just an animated series that was to be syndicated. And it's available, I believe, on Disney Plus now. And it's actually a pretty good series. It's fairly faithful to the characters because Stan really wanted something like that. He was looking to get these characters more popularized. So he wanted to make it a more serious approach. But NBC came to Marvel and said, look, we'd like something to counter ABC's Super Friends, and we'd like to do a Spider Friends show with Spider-Man. Because Spider-Man at that point had already had a series on, I think it was CBS. It had a live action series, and it had a one Saturday morning show in the late 60s that Ralph Bakshi did. So they wanted to do a Spider Friends series combining some superheroes with Spider-Man. And initially, those were to be the Human Torch and Iceman to do a fire and ice thing. But they quickly realized they weren't going to use the Human Torch because, of course, children would immolate themselves to imitate the Human Torch, which everybody knows is ridiculous, but this was the thinking, standards, and practices at the time. So I got the opportunity with John Romita to create Firestar, and John came up with an initial design of the girl, which was, of course, gorgeous because that's what John Romita does. And he just did a wonderful body shape that I was able to work over. And I created a very simple costume for it and stylized the hair to look like flames. And that became the trio. And from there, Will and Larry and I became real acorns in the shoe to everybody in the studio to bring in more superheroes from the Marvel universe. So that's why you began to see Doctor Strange and Captain America and all these other superheroes appear at the show. And the ones we really kept telling them you got to do is the X-Men, because this is going to be huge someday. We all felt it was just great for what it was, because we all understood that it was about kids who were rejected in society, which every teenager feels at some time, and finding a place to utilize their skills. And of course, that's what the X-Men is all about. It's about people who are rejected by society and finding a place to use their skills to become helpful to the world, even if the world still can't accept them. But that's just a great concept, and the characters were wonderful. So by the end of the first season, we got an episode in there where Firestar, it turns out, had been one of the X-Men, which Marvel sooner or later made a reality within the comics icon. So we had a great time working on the show. The second season was even more fun. The only fun that wasn't involved was Firestar was really sexy in the first season.
I was going to go there.
And then NBC comes along and says, Standards and Practices like you to take her breast size down and take a little bit off the crack in her butt, please. So I did that, and by the third season, she had really tiny breasts and virtually no indication that there was, anything other than a rear end there on the back.
Firestar was too hot.
Yeah, it was too hot for little girls and boys, But everybody loves the character. It has stood the test of time. And along the way, they sold the Hulk to NBC, so we did an hour show with Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk. Of course, they changed things from the originals, but they still had all the original characters there, but they had to make Rick Jones into a long hair country boy, and that's okay. He was still Rick Jones. And other than that, most everybody stayed very similar to the comics, and we brought in a lot of the characters from the comics and that. And once that was done, Hasbro approached the studio because they wanted to have something to help sell G.I. Joe toys, because they were formatting G.I. Joe into action figures, the first kind of action figures. And this was about the time that George Lucas was starting to think that merchandising of Star Wars was going to be a great thing. So everybody thought action figures was the way to go, which it was. It turned out to be a huge thing for everybody. They approached Marvel about doing a 5-part G.I. Joe miniseries that would be shown in syndications across the U.S., but not all at the same time period, which was a disadvantage, of course, because people would have to search for it to find out where it was being shown in their area. But once it was completed and put on the air, it was a monstrous hit. We were all shocked. From there, they developed a series and so forth, and the idea of selling toys via, cartoons became got out of control, to be really honest.
What were the hardest and the most enjoyable parts of this process? Because I do believe that it must have been complicated.
It was, but it was total freedom from standards and practices. Hasbro didn't really want to hold back on the action. They wanted to be careful about the violence. There's certainly no blood and no bullets. We used like laser guns and stuff, but we could actually have fist fights in it. I'd never had the opportunity to do one in animation, and the first one that I got to choreograph was Scarlet fighting a number of Cobra guys, and that was just like liberation for me. It was just fun to do because that's real action that you can have fun with. And if certainly nobody's getting hurt, really. I mean, the guys get knocked out, but kids don't really see it that way because nobody's getting killed like you see in films. Sorry, I had a piece of paper loose. Nobody's getting killed like you see in action films these days. So there was no mortality involved. But we also got to do all kinds of action, gunfights, things like that we've never done. And I'm not saying these things are necessary, but they are necessary to move forward storytelling in an action story, because you need the element of danger. And if you don't have danger and the idea that the heroes might actually get hurt, then there's no reason to be involved in what you're watching.